I have a lovely man in front of me at the moment, Dr. Trevor Stammers. Hello.
Hello, Andy. Nice to be with you.
Now I'm chatting to you because on my weekly show I have a mutual acquaintance, Dr. Richard Scott GP, who recommended you.
That was very kind of Richard. We've appeared on a couple of television programs in the past together. Yeah, yeah, he's a good bloke.
Yeah, well, we sort of vaguely touched on ethics, and he said, "Well, Andy, I think I can do a bit of this, but really, you want somebody who's much more learned in this particular field." So we were looking at gene editing. We were looking at specifically the issue of sickle cell anemia and thalassemia, and how gene editing could affect that, and all the good things of that. But he said we need to look at the ethics, so we did. So that's why he said, "Let's go deeper with ethics." Hence, why he suggested you.
Right, right. Well, I was a medic like Richard myself, and then I switched to academia, and so I taught ethics or moral philosophy. It's a branch of that at university for around about 10 years. So, and really enjoyed that very much. So very happy to talk about that topic.
Okay, so you were a GP for quite a number of years. I know when we spoke before, and I think it's worth touching on this before we get into anything else. You told me about an issue where you'd lost your sight and then you regained it. Do you want to just go through that for us?
Yes, yeah, well remembered. You never forget these things. And I was actually working part-time at uni and was at my computer about 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 8th of March, about 10 years ago. And the vision in my left eye suddenly, instantly vanished completely. The eye went totally dark. And I thought, oh, I think my retina has just come off. So I said to a colleague, I need to pop down to the hospital. I went down, they confirmed it. And to keep the story short, I lost the sight in the other eye a month later. And Moorfields Hospital did an absolutely amazing job in restoring my sight. And the Lord really helped me throughout that, along with my family, to remain calm. I'd had a couple of illnesses in the past where I'd remained far from calm, but I can honestly say the peace of God really kept me throughout that entire time. And about 9 months later, I got my sight back. But at that point, I switched careers. I wouldn't recommend that as a way of switching careers, but again, an opportunity opened up for me to teach. So full time in the institution I'd been working part time before. My sight has remained very good since, I'm pleased to say.
Yeah, you've clearly got a very broad understanding of ethics. I know from a previous chat we had. How did your loss of sight affect, or did it not, your views on ethics? Did it strengthen them? Did it make you question them?
I think obviously it made me have personal questions that we all face when things go wrong about if we're followers of Christ, where is God in all this? But as I've said, paradoxically and contrary to what one might predict, I really felt his closeness in a way that I hadn't before. And I think that it just changed the pattern of my life in a way that makes me really grateful for the experience. And I did have another a doctor friend of mine who said to me, "Would you have felt grateful to God if He hadn't restored your sight?" Which is a challenging question.
Yeah,
we'll leave that one hanging.
That's for another day. Okay, so I know we've talked about some of the things that we can discuss in regards to ethics now, but I was just curious about how personal experiences like losing your sight, even if you're confident maybe it's not too bad, maybe it could come back. And clearly you've got a much wider understanding than many of us as a doctor. But those sort of things that define who we are or what we can do, it's very easy for us then, as you say, to start to question things. And it's really interesting that you felt the closeness of God more, which to me actually makes perfect sense. But I guess to some maybe that wouldn't, because then you start to say, well, why have you done this to me, God? And you're hating me, and what did I do? But actually, it makes sense to me that you start to depend more on him as we lose one of our senses effectively. Well, actually, we have a choice, don't we? We can lean more or we can push back more.
Right. For every crisis, we have a choice, and if God is real, which is one of the things we'll be talking about, and some of the evidence for that, then He's real in the darkness as well as in the light.
Amen to that. Right. Do you want me to go through what we've talked about, or do you just want to sort of begin on ethics?
Well, you'd asked me to say a little bit about ethics, and since it's a branch of philosophy, and since my early Christian life was, I wasn't brought up in a Christian family, but I encountered a church when I was in my early teens, which was with hindsight, I think, quite wary of philosophy. And I don't think that Christians ought to be wary of it. I know that the New Testament talks about the philosophy of this world, but those the three words at the end of this world make the point that there can be philosophy that is not of the cosmos. There is philosophy simply means lover of wisdom. And I was actually preaching yesterday, and one of the texts that I had in the sermon was from 1 Corinthians 1, verse 24, where Paul says that Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. And there is an absolutely beautiful picture in Proverbs chapter 8, where for the Christian reader, it seems to me absolutely clear that Jesus himself is personified as wisdom. And I'd just like to read a couple of verses from the end of that, where this is Christ as wisdom would see it, Christ as wisdom as many Christians would see it. And now, O sons, listen to me. Blessed are those who keep my ways, hear my instruction, be wise, and do not neglect it. Blessed is the one who listens to me, watching at my gates and waiting beside my doors. So I think, if you like, if you regard philosophy as understanding what makes the world tick, then it's important for us to do that as Christians. And the other thing to me about philosophy when I started studying it is that Plato, one of the philosophers that usually you start off learning about, although he was no Christian, he did say in one of his writings that the sense of wonder is the mark of the philosopher, and philosophy has no other origin. And that just brings to mind to me the psalm, that Psalm 8, I think it is, that talks about when I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, what is man that you're mindful of him? And that sense of wonder in the psalmist leading to the question about what is it to be human, which is another very important philosophical question, of course. So those are the reasons why I think philosophy is really important. And ethics is a branch of that, which is about the study of the nature of right and wrong. Are these concepts meaningful? How do we ground them? And closely related to that is a big philosophical word that it actually is also very important, I think, for Christian belief as well. And it's something called epistemology. And that's looking at how we ground truth. How can we know things? How can we be sure that they're true? And that's, of course, a question that's very relevant to theology and faith as well. So that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction, and perhaps sell the topic a bit to listeners.
I love the idea of ethics. So a bit of history for myself is I did Christian theology at school at A level. For those not in the UK, that's kind of 16 to 18 years or so. It's the last thing you do in a school context before you go off to college or university. And we, as part of that, had to look at ethics. And the question we were phrased was all around a Down syndrome child. Should we be terminating pregnancies if someone's going to have Down syndrome because of the quality of life that person may well have? And that was basically the question. And I remember writing a very passionate essay as a very Bible-believing Christian at the time. And my teacher, who was a lovely, lovely man, said, Andy, this was an A. All the way through your document was an A. And my last paragraph, I basically ripped to shreds whoever would write such a stupid question as this, because you can't do value of life based on a potential disease. And he said, you can't say that in an essay. That's everything else was apparently great. It's my best essay, but I really ripped to shreds the question because it really incensed me that how dare anybody assign a value of life against a condition that somebody may have in the future.
Yes, now that's interesting, isn't it? Because it shows the depth of feeling that we all have about these issues. And that may be a good point for me to introduce another concept and spell it out, because it's very relevant to that ethical debate and a lot of others. And that's about the difference between moral realism, sometimes called objective morality, and moral subjectivity or moral relativism. And the key point about moral realism is that moral realists believe that there are moral facts. And that means that when, I mean, to take hopefully a non-controversial example, when we say that Nazism was wicked and Hitler was a bad person, we are stating a fact about the universe. Whereas moral relativism or subjectivism would criticize that and say, no, that is just your opinion. There are no moral facts. It's all relative. And whether we're moral objectivists or relativists, our emotions are always engaged as well. And, there's a story popular amongst ethics teachers that a student writes an essay saying that there's no such thing as morality, really, it's all relative. And the lecturer gives that a naught, as you are going to get. The student will then say, well, that's outrageous. But of course, on the grounds of what they've written, if there is no objectivity, then my opinion that what is written is worthless, justifies the mark. And I think those times when we catch ourselves feeling really strongly that, this is wrong, we are latching on to something, I think, of the witness to the fact that we are made in the image of a God who is absolute truth and who is absolutely just, whether we recognize it or not. Okay.
I'm just looking through some of the notes of what we can talk about today, because we had a conversation before, because this could go on for days. One, because I really like talking about it. Two, you clearly do. And we have to sort of make it finite somehow to fit within a show.
Sure.
But one of the things you said was the limits of knowledge and the philosophy of science and how it can help. How do we define or even start to understand the limits of knowledge beyond the really simplistic element of I know what I know and I know I don't know everything? Now, clearly there's more to it than that, but we don't know what we don't know. We can only know what we do know. So talk to us a bit about the limits of knowledge and science and philosophy.
Right. Well, perhaps the easiest way of getting into this subject is to use an illustration, and this comes from one of the books of a guy I wanted to certainly recommend his books anyway. So I'll take the opportunity of doing that. And his name is John Lennox, and he's an emeritus professor of maths, or he may actually still be actually working professor of maths, and a fellow, I think, in philosophy of science at Oxford University. And if listeners have never come across any of his books, all of them are good. The first one of his I ever read was his first Christian book, I think, called God's Undertaker. Has Science Buried God? And he's brilliant at making these sorts of concepts very lucid. Now, the illustration I wanted to share with you in response to your question was that he was speaking at a meeting of very learned scientists, and one of them asked him, how can you claim to be a true scientist when you are a Christian believer? And he challenged him in the meeting and said, unless you can explain to me how the Christ you believe in can possibly be God and a human being at the same time, I just don't think you're worth listening to. So John said to him, okay, well, I will attempt to explain that if I can ask you a much simpler question and you can answer it. So he accepted the challenge. So John said to him, can you tell me what consciousness is? And the scientist smiled and said, well, that is very difficult to explain. So John said to him, well, how about telling me what energy is? So the scientist then said, well, it's something that we can describe with equations. And I'm not very good at maths, but I think its energy is mc squared or something, isn't it? And
yeah.
And John then said to him, yes, we can give equations that describe it, but can you tell me what it is? And the scientist then smiled, and John said, yes, I've read Feynman, as you have, who tells us that we do not know what energy is. So his adversary then said, oh, I can see where you're going. And he said, yes, precisely. Should I dismiss you because you as a scientist can't tell me precisely what energy is? So I think that's a good illustration of how even with something that may be regarded as objective, as science, we have to come to terms with complexities like paradox. And in O-level science, we learn that light behaves as a wave, but it also behaves as particles, and we just give it, the name of the wave particle paradox. And when you start getting into quantum physics, it's possible for something to be, as I understand it, in my simple way, in two places at once. So I think the more we get to know about science, actually, the more it should humble us about our human overreach as to how much we can know. And I think where this is particularly relevant to Christianity, of course, is that we cannot know about the God who created the universe and who created us, who is spirit, unless he reveals himself to us. And even the use of he is something that has to come by revelation. So one of the things that is absolutely fundamental, I think, to Christian faith is that we do have to get to grips with Scripture, because it claims to be God-breathed, and it therefore gives us knowledge of things that we cannot otherwise know. Now, I'm not sure whether that's where you wanted to go, but that's where I've gone.
I go wherever. I love these interviews because whoever I speak with, I never have a plan. I don't have a set of questions. It's just trying to get to understand the person I'm speaking with. And, the odd little question as it comes up, and it's very much inspired by the person. So, yeah, there's no plan. I'm happy for it to go wherever, which
Well,
is a good thing.
well, perhaps I could follow on that by mentioning Immanuel Kant, who I was going to talk about in my intro, but he sort of went by the way. Now Immanuel Kant is regarded as being the philosopher's philosopher. He had a brain the size of a planet, and lived in Prussia, which is now part of Russia, in the 1700s. So he died in 1804. And he's a very interesting chap. He was brought up in a Lutheran family, and clearly had a Christian upbringing, which in part he abandoned because he truly was a very clever chap, and regarded the teachers in his Christian school as not being very good teachers. So that's a warning to all of us who teach that our pupils will judge us by the quality of how we teach. But written on his tombstone is a statement from one of his most famous works called The Critique of Practical Reason. And this is on his tombstone. Two things fill the heart with ever renewed and increasing awe and reverence, the more often and more steadily we meditate upon them. And those two things are the starry firmament above and the moral law within. Now, when I heard that, immediately Psalm 19 came to mind. And I'm sure that even though Kant may or may have not rejected the faith of his childhood, the scriptures he knew, and I think that must have influenced his thinking at that point. The heavens declare the glory of God in verse 1 there, and the stars proclaim his handiwork. And then later on, the law of the Lord is perfect. And still today, the vastness of the universe and our seeming insignificance in the light of it, and yet the moral law in our heart that witnesses that there is something special and inviolable, that, as you were saying, that killing a child with Down syndrome, it makes us think, and it should make us tremble, because all human beings, no matter how intelligent or unintelligent they are made in the image of God, and our intelligence does not give us our value. It's the fact of who our creator is. Later on in another one of his books, Kant, with all his wisdom, distills down just three questions as being crucial for us to have answers to in order to live a flourishing life. And those questions were: what can I know? What must I do? And what may I hope for? And he was absolutely right. All of us need, even at an unconscious level, have answers to those questions, which are also questions that the scriptures ask and give us answers to as well. And I just found that fascinating. I don't recommend folks sort of delving into Kant as their first dabble in his philosophy, but he was a man who I think even though he may not have recognized it coming from his Christian roots, got a lot of things right.
Bringing ethics to, I suppose, a reality check on it. How do we actually intersect ethics with life, with faith? I mean, gene editing was where we began because it was the idea of gene editing. Actually, there are some serious ethical issues around that. As Christians, we clearly should be speaking up. I mean, that's a very, very biblical concept, whether it's the standing in the gap idea or just, speaking out. If we don't care about our future because we know our future, then it doesn't matter in this life what happens to us. So we can stand up regardless of the consequences. But how do we take all that we know mentally and apply it into some of the ethics that we're seeing? How controversial do you want to go? The current era of life, my truth is better than your truth. That's one you've heard. Or what I feel is fact, which is a real current contentious issue. How do we face off those issues with compassion, but with truth and ethics?
Yes. Well, I think you've touched on one there that we certainly could speak about, and has become very impossible not to speak about in our culture, and that is the issue of gender identity. And I think speaking from in terms of what we've been talking about, it illustrates extremely well how the idea that my feelings about something determine everything, and I am what I feel, not only runs counter to moral conventions, but even biology. And that for anyone who is a scientist, I think, as well as a person of faith, must give us pause for thought about, where we will head if we concede that just because something feels something passionately and strongly within, that must be acknowledged as objective truth. So I found myself amazed to read the article by Richard Dawkins, and we would obviously disagree on the position of Christian faith, but he too sees this as a threat, and has been widely criticized, as I will be as a Christian, for saying that we cannot change that, and to fly in the face of biological reality is going to ultimately end in tragedy. And of course, we are seeing, I think, the beginnings of this unfolding now. But that's a topic that requires a whole program in itself. But I hope it's answered your question, although probably not the questions of many listeners, understandably.
Yeah, it's one of those difficult ones. Well, if it's an easy answer, then that's fine. But if it's difficult, we'll steer away from that. We don't want to offend anybody. But actually, if we want to follow the example of Christ, if we believe in who God is, if we believe in the value of Scripture, actually, we should be willing, regardless of the consequences, to speak into situations, not in a, you're wrong, you're stupid way, but actually with, this is what I believe. So how do we better engage? I suppose we're thinking more sort of medical, and we start with the medical, so let's refine it to that. But how do we answer more or speak more into the medical community, science, research, which of course is going to push boundaries, and some of those boundaries they're going to be pushing are going to be ethical ones.
Yeah, well, the words of the Apostle Peter just come into mind, that we should always be ready to give a reason for the hope that's within us, but we should do it with gentleness is certainly one of the qualities that he mentioned. And one of the things that sort of saddens me But it's connected, I think, with being people of conviction, that we obviously should be convinced that we are right and have reason for giving it. But that doesn't give us the right to be rude or aggressive, or certainly not, physically violent towards people. And we do need to put our own house in order. And, Jesus said, I am gentle and lowly of heart. And one of the things that impresses me about John Lennox, and I did spend a couple of weeks with him on a mission team in Russia some years ago, is that he is a man of vast learning. I think he speaks about 9 different languages fluently, including Russian, for example, quite aside from his science, but a more gentle and humble person you couldn't fail to meet. So it's sometimes not just a matter of what we say, and indeed sometimes we should say less, but it's who we are, and that makes it important that on a daily basis we do our level best to stay as close to Christ as we can, because we never know when an awkward person like Andy will be, asking us questions.
Yeah.
Microphone.
Okay, let's bring us back to an author that many of us probably will have heard, although for very different reasons. C.S. Lewis. We probably know him from the Chronicles of Narnia, amongst other things. But you mentioned mere Christianity, the moral existence for God, because one of the things I remember at school very clearly, it was a Christian theology A-level, and there was a Catholic school, there was a Church of England school. In our course, we had a Muslim, there were Methodists, there were people who said, I don't believe in God. And it made for some lively debates, let's put it that way, especially when we were encouraged to debate. But I remember talking about things, and someone said one day, you use God and faith as a crutch in your life, and without that crutch, you wouldn't get through. I think he thought he got me. I don't think my answer made him happy, because what I said was absolutely right. If I could find 2 crutches or 4, I'd use those as well. I absolutely use my faith as a crutch in life, because without Jesus Christ in my life becomes infinitesimally more complicated and difficult. I absolutely use it as a crutch. C.S. Lewis wrote the book Mere Christianity, amongst other things. But that idea of God, how can you say what's right and wrong? You're just saying what's right and wrong because of God. Well, yes, that's how I get my plumb line. That's my foundation. How can we speak into people? I mean, this book is one that we know. So what can Mere Christianity, the book that C.S. Lewis wrote, how can that help us?
Yeah, well, Mere Christianity is a sort of collection of several books. And the first book is one that deals with the question of how living in a moral universe points to God. And the first book is called Right and Wrong, as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And although this Mere Christianity was written in the 1950s, I still recommend it to anyone who wants to try to get a grip on how Christianity can make sense in the modern world. And C.S. Lewis was a prophet. I mean, he saw into our current future with AI and so on, and the beginnings of that. But with regard to the argument in this is a clue to the meaning of the universe, there are several steps, and I need to just have it in front of me, and I won't go through all of them. It'll just give viewers and listeners a flavor. His first argument is that there must be an absolute moral law, and by that he means moral realism or moral objectivity must be true. And he says otherwise disagreements wouldn't be possible. Promise and treaty keeping would be totally unnecessary. And moreover, we wouldn't need to make excuses to ourselves for breaking that moral law. And of course, our consciences, although they can be seared, are also a witness to the fact that, there is this something inside us that makes us feel guilty, at least initially, when we do wrong. And the second point he makes is this can't be a sort of evolutionary herd instinct to protect the species, because sometimes obeying it leads us to put our lives in danger. And we do feel a moral impulse to help those. He gives the example of if we saw a child fall into a stream, when it's against our own interests and we may put ourselves in danger. And then he says it can't just be a mere social convention, because judgments about the moral values of a society only make sense if the basis of the judgment is independent of that society. And he goes on to deal with various other objections. I might just take one more if I can scroll up. Oh yeah, he also says it can't be a mere social convention. It says that it's rather like maths, and there he's rather like Kant, who was also pretty good at maths. 2 plus 2 equals 4 it exists outside of social convention. And to go back to what I said at the start, that Hitler was a wicked person. Even most moral relativists, if they claim to be, they're not going to counter that. So they then need to come to grips with, well, why? Lewis, on the back of this and a few other arguments, says, well, this moral law must reside in our mind. Because moral laws come from minds and not just from matter, not just from physical things. There is something more than that. An architect is not part of a building, and the source of the moral law cannot be a part of the universe itself. And from there, of course, he makes the claim that therefore there must be a mind, which is the source of the moral law. And that for Lewis came to be the Lord Jesus Christ. And just recently, there's been quite a lot of publicity about his conversion, and he described himself as coming kicking, screaming into the kingdom of God, and the most reluctant convert in the whole of England, and was clearly very persuaded by the evidence.
Let me finish with a question. Can morals evolve?
Wow, I wasn't expecting that one.
Sorry, it came to mind as you were talking.
I think that moral truth does remain absolute, and there are key moral issues that absolutely do not change, just as 2 plus 2 equals 4 doesn't change, and not murdering it is an example of that. But I think the way in which we have to apply moral judgments to evolving issues, particularly like things like artificial intelligence, which is a whole other program in itself. We have to think about the evolution of the application of them and how they apply to new entities that may arise that some people will also claim are persons, but that's another story.
Fine. Okay. I'm going to have to bring this to a close. I could sit here all day talking with you about this. I've got lots of other thoughts, but they're going to have to not come now. Thank you so much for your time, Trevor. Ethics is one of those that I think we'll just take it or leave it until the point that we can't leave it, because it suddenly throws into our face something that we have to wrestle with. A classic one would be a parent who becomes old, has dementia. And one of the questions I've seen many times is, should you lie? Now, as a Christian, my answer is, well, absolutely not. But I've also met Christian medics who've said, Well, yeah, it's not really like because they won't remember. So at some point we're going to have to wrestle with ethics. It's not something we can think, well, it's for somebody else to deal with. There is going to be a moment in our life, or many moments, where we are going to have to confront an ethical dilemma. We're going to have to enter an ethical debate, even if it's just with ourselves. Let me finish with this. How can we best prepare ourselves for what will happen at some point, in that we will have to deal with ethics, regardless of our viewpoint on it?
Well, my honest answer to that would be that if you're a believer, we need to deepen our confidence and knowledge and personal walk with God, because I personally think that difficult times are ahead. We may think they are difficult now, but if we do not have a rock on which we are basing our lives, we will crumble. And if your listeners don't yet know Christ personally, I would say start exploring, look at the evidence. Christianity is a good place to start, because if you've got it in one, Andy, that all of us at some point it's going to come home to roost, relativists or not, and we're going to see it in our family, perhaps in our nation, and possibly on a global scale. And we'll need to think in advance, preferably, about how we're going to deal with it.
Which I guess is where faith comes into this, because if we believe in God, who is unshakable and unchangeable, we have what we call the rock. I mean, it's religious language in some respects, although it shouldn't be. God is the rock, and therefore we have a place of safety from which to do our thinking. If you don't have that rock, then what you're standing on is going to change, and it's going to sink, and it's going to throw you up in the air because it isn't stable. And I guess that's the point of Christianity for me personally, is I've got something which I can rely upon because it doesn't change.
Yeah, I don't know if that saying that there were no atheists in the trenches and the war was true, but it's not a good thing to be in the trench, that's for sure.
No. Trevor, thank you so much. I've loved this. I've been looking forward to it for a long time. I love the issue of ethics. I love considering about ethics. I don't like dealing with some of the ethical issues, but I like to talk about some of the ethical issues. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure for me too. You've drawn out some interesting questions. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.